Let's introduce now Dr. Schunemann, a very special guest from Canada. Dr. Schunemann is the chair and professor at the Department of Health Research Methods, Evidence and Impact at McMaster University. He holds the Michael Jen Chair in Healthcare Research, and he is the director of Cochrane Canada and the McMaster Grade Center. He is a member of the Guideline International Network Board of Trustees, the Advisory Committee of Health Research at the WHO, and the co-director of the McMaster University WHO Collaborating Center for Evidence-Informed Policymaking. Dr. Schunemann's scientific work focuses on evidence synthesis, quality of life research, and the development and presentation of healthcare recommendations spanning several disciplines, from clinical medicine to public health, including environmental and occupational health. Dr. Schunemann is talking today about the use of grades for exposures, addressing the research question formulation, the evidence certainty assessment, as well as the grade guidelines for exposure study result synthesis. So welcome, Dr. Schunemann. The stage is yours.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I can help myself. Thanks very much for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here. This is my third trip to Bilbao, and it's getting nicer every time. So thanks for the invitation. I will try to speak slowly, although that will make my presentation a little longer for the poor translators who will have to do that. But I will start by telling you where I'm from. So I'm coming from Canada. That's about there. I work at McMaster University in Hamilton, close to Toronto. It's widely considered the birthplace of evidence-based medicine and problem-based learning. If you want to know more about the department that I chair, you can probably just Google us. These are my disclosures that were already mentioned in part. I chair the Great Working Group and I direct Cochrane Canada. I don't have any direct financial conflicts of interest, but I'd like to strongly acknowledge one of our PhD students, now a PhD, Rebecca Morgan, whose work is widely reflected in what I'm going to speak about. Now, I in my life had about that much of occupational health training, occupational medicine training, so that always creates a risk of embarrassing myself. So I hope that you forgive me if there's anything that doesn't make a lot of sense to you. But we were looking for quite some time now at the application of grade that I will speak more about in evidence assessment system to fields such as environmental and occupational health. And that actually raised quite a few questions. It actually raised questions about how to ask the right questions, both in clinics, as an occupational health professional, as well as in the context of research and in the context of systematic reviews, something that Paul just touched on. So I will touch on two topics now. One is about asking the right questions, and the other is I'm speaking a bit more about assessing studies for their credibility or risk of bias assessment in the context of grade. Now, I'll ask you one quick question. Who of you has ever conducted a systematic review? Okay, that's good. Who of you is a researcher? Okay, that's about 1/3 of the room. Okay. Good. So let me start. I'll start just by giving you a little bit of an overview in terms of where this work is coming from. This has to do with guideline development or healthcare recommendations, which we typically look at as an ultimate tool to provide the right guidance for the patients or the people, workers that we care for. And just to put everything that I'm going to say into context, typically what happens is when people develop practice guidelines, there is hopefully some good organization, budget, and planning involved by some group that wants to do that. There are people involved, typically a guideline panel, that's the group that develops actual recommendations. And then there are typically professional societies that help with oversight, and other consumers and stakeholders. Conflicts of interest are important to consider, and documentation needs to take place. But the reason why I put this up is that typically what happens when we develop healthcare guidelines, we need to ask the right questions. We need to ask good questions, because otherwise everything that follows downstream, from the evidence assessment in systematic reviews to actually determining recommendations, is really hard to do. So we need to get these questions right. And I'll start with just an example, a very quick example of work that a couple of colleagues of ours have been involved with, and that is interventions to prevent occupational noise-induced hearing loss. This is a Cochrane systematic review, the type of research that Paul just introduced. And what would be typical in a systematic review like this would be asking a question that would look like the following. So in workers exposed to noise, what is the impact of hearing protection devices compared to not wearing hearing protection devices on hearing loss and hearing impairment? And from there, these type of questions would be addressed in the systematic review. From there, we can we derive that this question format. It deals with defining a population and intervention and comparison and outcomes. We call that a PECO question. This is a type of question. These four components are relevant whether or not you practice occupational health or you do research, when you address interventions that may actually be beneficial or not beneficial. And again, so that would be a typical type of guideline question here that we would address through an evidence review to then offer a recommendation such as that workers in certain settings should be wearing hearing protection devices. That's all good. And that's where we typically apply methods such as those by the Great Working Group to derive recommendations, and we'll hear a little bit more about that over time. But I'd like to focus on something else because I think we figured this out quite well. That is the formulation of questions when we address healthcare interventions. And the way that we typically do that is there's a guideline panel, just to give you an overview. A guideline panel develops that type of questions. There's a systematic review, as we just heard from Paul about, that is typically done. We synthesize the evidence in digestible formats that includes an assessment of the certainty of the evidence. That then is put into something that we call evidence to decision frameworks. That is a list of criteria that should be considered to develop a recommendation. In the GRADE approach, we typically develop recommendations that are either strong, all stars are aligned, we know what to do, or conditional, and that is when there are certain things that we are not as sure about, or when, for instance, people's values and preferences play a role, or interventions are very costly. But that typically ends up in a guideline. Okay, so that's the classic approach. That's what we've typically done with GRADE. I want to point you to a different problem, and those are questions about etiology. In other words, we could ask a question not so much about what interventions we should use to prevent hearing loss, but we could ask questions about, is noise exposure actually associated with hearing loss or hearing impairment? And the obvious answer will be yes. But the type of data that we typically look at under those circumstances, or and that relates to other situations like this as well, the typical data that we are looking at and the type of questions that we are asking are quite different. And in our work in the field of environmental health, we've struggled a lot with making sure that we ask the right questions, in particular in the context of research. So, for instance, for understanding whether or not something is a cause of something else, we might ask questions around association. So, for instance, to assess the association between exposure and an outcome, including in the field of nutrition, environmental, and occupational health, the concept of defining the population, including animal species, exposure, comparators, and outcomes, which we call PECO with an E under those circumstances, as pillars of the question is increasingly accepted. That's all good. However, sorry, I actually did fix this. Sorry for that mix-up there. That's because I've been using a different computer. So a question in this context could actually look like the following. In people, is exposure to noise compared to no noise or different levels of noise, for instance, when we have exact cutoffs, associated with hearing loss or hearing impairment? And the type of data that you would be looking at are data, for instance, that connect age to the degree of hearing impairment, different types of hearing exposure in different types of workers, or this type of data. This is, for instance, how minors compare to the regular population and how exposure to different type of noise at the workplace leads to a certain deficit. And you see there that these are different shapes of distributions. And under those circumstances, the asking the right questions becomes much more complicated. So the purpose of this work that I'm going to present now is to provide you, or provide a framework for asking the right questions in the context of health effects of occupational or other types of exposures. This is a paper that was published in Environmental Health, Environment International, and it basically focuses on this particular framework. So there hasn't been any guidance really, any guiding framework for operationalizing that concept of thinking about the population, the exposure, comparators, and outcomes for researchers and decision makers. So our goal was to really make that, develop a framework and make that clear for those who ask either research or clinical questions, and epidemiological questions, I should say. And we developed 5 paradigmatic approaches and examples for identifying the exposure and comparator for systematic reviews and decision-making type of questions. Okay, so the first is, for instance, that one might be interested in exploring the shape and distribution of a relationship between the exposure and an outcome in a systematic review. The second is that one might use cutoffs defined or based on distributions in the studies that have been identified in a systematic review. One could use mean cutoffs from external or other populations, and I will explain all of that in more detail. One can use existing exposure cutoffs associated with known health outcomes, or one can select the comparator based on exposure cutoffs that can be achieved through interventions. Let me take you through that just to give you those 5 examples. So, for instance, the first purpose may be to identify an association between an exposure and an outcome. One would explore the shape and distribution of a relationship between the exposure and the outcome, for instance, through a systematic review. And an example would be, among newborns, what is the incremental effect of a 10 decibel increase in noise exposure during gestation on postnatal hearing impairment? So a PECO question would be, among newborns, what is the effect of a 10 decibel increase from a 10 decibel baseline on postnatal hearing impairment? Second scenario, we do not know naturally occurring exposure levels or are unsure about what cutoffs to choose when we ask a clinical or a research question. One would use cutoffs that may be defined based on a distribution in the individual study. So, for instance, one would compare the outcome of hearing impairment using the lowest quintile against the highest quintile in a population distribution. So, among newborns, what is the effect of the highest noise exposure during pregnancy compared to the lowest noise exposure during pregnancy, to understand if there is an association with postnatal hearing impairment. Third, to evaluate the association between an exposure cutoff and a comparison cutoff. So, for instance, we may have information about a certain exposure level for a population of interest, but want to compare that to the impact of a different level of exposure on a certain health outcome. Under those circumstances, one might use mean cutoffs from external or other populations that may come from other research. For example, a question that one would ask is, among commercial pilots, what is the effect of noise corresponding to their occupational exposure, and comparing that to noise exposure experienced in other occupations, and what that does to hearing impairment. So typical PECO under those circumstances would be, among commercial pilots, what is the effect of noise corresponding to their occupational exposure versus noise exposure experienced by people in low exposure occupations on hearing impairment. Fourth, and you see that these are all quite different questions that one can ask in the context of occupational exposure, and it's actually quite important to get the question right, in particular if you work in the field of research, because otherwise you won't get the answer that you are potentially looking for. So, for instance, one might, in the context of occupational exposure, be interested in permissive levels. And under those circumstances, one might use existing exposure cutoffs associated with a known health outcome. So that is when more research has already been done. And the question under those circumstances could be, among industrial workers, what is the effect of exposure below 80 decibel compared to over 80 decibel for a certain time period on hearing impairment? So same type of PECO that I just described. Using a cutoff that is known to produce from other type of research a certain degree of impact. And then finally, we're moving closer to health decision making, going into that field of making recommendations. The fifth way of thinking about these population exposure comparison and outcome questions is that when decision makers may be interested in a specific exposure cutoff that can actually be achieved through an intervention, and be interested in looking systematically in what, for instance, the preventable fraction may be, such as simple earmuffs in a high-noise environment, occupational environment. Under those circumstances, one would select a comparator based on whatever exposure cutoffs can be achieved, as I said, through an intervention. So, for instance, among the general population, what is the effect of an intervention that reduces noise levels by 20 decibels compared to no intervention? That could be, as I said, either in the occupational setting or, for instance, by coding streets differently that are frequented by trucks. So that's the type of work that we actually needed to do or need to do in order to ask the right questions in healthcare research as it relates to exposures, including occupational exposures, obviously. I want to spend just a few more minutes, the remaining 10 or 15 minutes then, to demonstrate how this type of thinking, the asking the right questions, actually leads to evidence assessment. So, and here, in that context of of environmental and occupational exposures. We've produced work basically using that GRADE system, assessing the certainty of evidence in this context, and GRADE represents an untapped opportunity for looking at environmental and occupational health to make evidence-based recommendations in a systematic and transparent manner. I'll again use an example that Paul already introduced. So, for instance, what has been suggested is that higher exposure to BPA is associated with increased weight, and the question is, how certain can we be in this type of statement? What we would do, according to GRADE, is we would ask a few very specific questions, simple questions. One is, if we look at the research that is out there, how well is the research done? That refers to the risk of bias. Second question that we would ask is, are the results of studies that should be showing similar results, and we can only find similar results if we ask the question right, consistent across different studies? Third, how directly do the results of the research relate to that type of PECO question that I described? We call that indirectness. In classic epidemiological terms or epi terms, this is often called generalizability, external validity, applicability, transferability, or translatability. So in GRADE, we call that indirectness, very simply described as, here's the question, here's the evidence, how well does the evidence inform the question? Precision, that is, do you have a sufficient number of data, in a sense, that allow you to make statements about how likely random error is to explain an association? And then fifth, are these all of the studies that actually have been conducted? Paul referred to publication bias. That's essentially the fifth criterion. And then there are three criteria that help us be more certain that there may be an exposure-effect relationship when there are particularly large effects, when the worst-case scenario still predicts, suggests strong conclusions, or when there are exposure-effect relations or dose-effect relationships. And GRADE, just as a brief intro, the GRADE working group is actually a group that tried to bring sense to this type of assessment of how certain we can be in evidence. It's a system that has been developed over 20 years to make that type of assessment transparent and, as I said, structured, a sensible system for grading the certainty of evidence and making decisions. It's used by over 100 organizations across the world, including the World Health Organization and a number of other government and non-government organizations, including professional societies. It's for systematic reviews, HTA, and guidelines. Lots of contributors, over 600 contributors worldwide. We've published on this very widely with over 30,000 citations. For those of you in bibliometrics, you will know what that actually means. It means a lot. And there's lots of other publications, and there's some software tools that we are using to conduct this work and to develop good guidelines. So one of the problems, however, that we have encountered is that, and Paul also referred to that, was that the actual assessment of how well the research is done, the individual studies are done, has been quite challenging in the field of environmental and occupational health. So there have been tools that have been utilized to assess risk of bias, that was briefly described, but these tools largely have quite a few shortcomings. And what we set out to do over the past 3 years is working with environmental health epidemiologists and toxicologists to develop a risk of bias instrument for non-randomized studies of exposures. So this is of greater interest for those of you who do research. This has been published, again, just to acknowledge Rebecca there, this is part of her PhD. It's been published this year in Environmental Health. So basically what we did was we evaluated a new risk of bias instrument for non-randomized studies, which these studies often are. It's based on a on a previous tool. It's called Robin's Eye, that focused on interventions, and we adapted this tool to exposure studies. Basically, what we did is we, first of all, replaced interventions with exposures in the field of occupational and environmental health. And we, the tool has fundamentally at its heart a comparison against the ideal study that we could do that would demonstrate, for instance, whether or not BPA is associated with higher weights. And that ideal study would be an experimental study that has no confounding, in other words, a randomized experiment. And that's basically the heart of the tool. So number of steps that need to be done, and I'm raising this here, which is you need to get the question right. Therefore, all this work on the PECO that I described. I'll take you through that oops, I went to the wrong direction. I'll take you through that. So we would do a systematic review of the various studies that are out there, and then evaluate individual studies on a number of domains with that risk of bias tool, so confounding bias, selection bias, measurement of exposure, departures from exposure, that is those who are not constantly exposed to the type of environmental exposure that we are interested in, missing data, measurement error, or measurement of outcomes, and the reported results. Those are the domains in that tool. What we would typically do is we would assess a single study with regards to the risk that something in these categories would go wrong. And green means that there's a low risk of bias related to that particular domain, for instance, selection bias in a single study, or that there may be moderate, serious, or critical concerns in a domain. This would be done across all the studies that answer the type of question that we are interested in, that you would, at the end, have a matrix like this that would allow you to say the studies that have been included have concerns on any of these risk of bias domains that range from no concern, meaning green, to critical concern because something really went wrong in that study. You end up with an exposure, with a risk of bias matrix like this that will then allow you to make an overall assessment of the risk of bias of that body of evidence, the different studies that are included, that would sometimes allow you to say, you know, there is some problem with some studies, they are so bad that you wouldn't include them in your overall assessment. But basically what it allows you to do is to say, there are certain studies, these being individual studies of a systematic review, that have a particular concern, and overall that study might be labeled as being at high risk of bias or critical risk of bias, and that could be done across for each of these studies. Or you could take an approach and say, okay, here are the studies, these are the least concerning studies, how bad is that body of evidence on each of these bias domains? So confounding, for instance, measurement of exposure, which tells you about future research, but also about an overall risk of bias assessment. So for instance, that in this context, all of these studies seem to have major problems with measurement of exposure. All right, and then just to come back to that particular question, the individual studies provided information about BPA exposure and prevalent overweight, which basically suggested, this being the forest plots, that there's an increase frequency in overweight. The same thing would be done for a second outcome, in this case, prevalent obesity. Same type of outcome, obviously, again indicating that obesity is a problem, so different type of outcome. And we would then put this into an overall evidence assessment that would include all of these criteria that I described, the risk of bias across studies, 5 studies, serious risk of bias, and then a look at each of these individual descriptors that I already talked about. Do the studies show the same results, same biased results in this case? Is there a problem with indirectness, imprecision, or publication bias? And that would be supported by judgments to then make an overall assessment of how good the evidence is that BPA, for instance, is associated with these type of weight problems. Detailed description, most studies at risk of bias, although they adjusted for known confounders, residual confounding was still a big problem. Okay, so I showed you 2 pieces of work that are connected. That is, asking the right questions in the field of occupational and environmental exposures. There haven't been any good frameworks for asking these right questions. Here's a framework that can be utilized, 5 different scenarios. There may be more. Everybody's invited to think about this and think whether or not there are different scenarios beyond that. This is the start of some work. Then when you ask the right questions, that helps you with assessing individual studies that answer that question for risk of bias. And I briefly touched on an overall assessment of the certainty of the evidence related to environmental or other types of exposures that are increasingly used in the field that you're dealing with. Thanks very much.